In the shivering silence of a Christmas night in 1996, the upscale community of Boulder, Colorado, was tucked away under a blanket of fresh snow and the warm glow of holiday lights. It was a scene that mirrored the American dream in its most pristine form, a tableau of prosperity and peace, where the only sound should have been the soft whistle of the wind against the pines. But within the walls of a grand Tudor mansion on 15th Street, a tragedy was unfolding that would soon tear the heart out of the nation's collective innocence. To understand this case, we must first look at JonBenet Ramsey, not as a headline or a forensic subject, but as a 6-year-old girl whose life was a vibrant tapestry of laughter and childhood wonder. She was the daughter of John Ramsey, a successful software executive, and Patsy Ramsey, a former Miss West Virginia whose grace and devotion to her children were well known in their social circles. JonBenet was more than just a beauty queen with a radiant smile. She was a sister, a daughter, and a child of immense potential whose golden curls and bright eyes captured the imagination of a culture that thrives on the promise of youth and success. The morning of December 26th began with a scream that still echoes through the corridors of true crime history. At 5:52 a.m., a frantic 911 call from Patsy Ramsey shattered the early morning stillness. Her voice, thick with terror and desperation, pleaded for help, claiming that her daughter had been taken from her bed. For any parent, this is the ultimate nightmare. The moment the world stops spinning and the floor drops away. But as the first police officers arrived at the scene, they encountered a situation that felt profoundly and chillingly wrong. On the back staircase, Patsy had found a 2.5-page handwritten ransom note. It was a bizarre, rambling document demanding the strangely specific sum of $118,000, which, coincidentally or not, was almost the exact amount of John Ramsey's annual bonus. The note was signed by a mysterious victory committee, a group no one had ever heard of. In those initial hours, the air in the Ramsey home was heavy with a suffocating mix of hope and dread as the family and their friends gathered in the kitchen, waiting for a phone call from a kidnapper that would never come. As we delve into the culture of the 1990s, we see a society fascinated by the aesthetics of the perfect family. The Ramseys were the embodiment of that ideal, which made the unfolding horror all the more jarring. The police response, however, was tragically inadequate. Boulder was a town where murder was a rarity, and the department was ill-equipped for a case of this magnitude. They failed to cordon off the house properly, allowing the scene to be contaminated by well-meaning friends and the family themselves. This was not just a failure of procedure, it was a fundamental breakdown of the protective barrier that should exist between a crime and the truth. By midday, the atmosphere had shifted from frantic searching to a grim, heavy silence. The lead detective, Linda Arndt, asked John Ramsey and a family friend to search the house one more time, perhaps to give them something to do in their agony. They headed to the basement, a dark and labyrinthine area that would soon yield a discovery so horrific it would change the landscape of American justice forever. John Ramsey opened the door to a small, windowless room in the basement, a place used for wine storage, and there, in the dim light, he found the body of his youngest daughter. She was lying on the cold floor, covered by a white blanket, her hands tied above her head with a nylon cord. A piece of black duct tape was stretched across her mouth. The sight of a father carrying his lifeless child up the stairs, his face a mask of primal grief, is an image that haunts the witnesses to this day. It was a moment of profound human loss, the point where the investigation into a kidnapping became a hunt for a killer. But in that act of carrying her, more forensic evidence was lost, more fibers were shifted, and the truth became even more elusive. The realization that the predator had been inside the house all along, or perhaps had never left, sent a shockwave through the community. The safety of the home That sacred American concept had been violated in the most intimate and brutal way imaginable. The autopsy would later reveal the sheer savagery of the attack. Jean Benet had been strangled with a garrote, a sophisticated and cruel device made from a cord and a broken paintbrush handle. She had also suffered a massive blow to the head that had fractured her skull. The combination of these injuries suggested a level of premeditation and rage that was difficult to reconcile with the image of their quiet neighborhood. As the news spread, the media descended on Boulder like a swarm, turning a private tragedy into a public spectacle. The images of Jean Benet in her pageant costumes, wearing makeup and hairspray, were broadcast around the world, creating a narrative that was as much about the perceived oddities of the family as it was about the murder itself. This cultural fascination with the victim's appearance began to overshadow the reality of her death, leading to a divide in public opinion that remains to this day. Was it an intruder who had slipped through the shadows, or was the culprit someone who shared her name and her home? In those first few days, the grief of the Ramsey family was dissected by the public and the police alike. Every gesture, every tear, and every word was scrutinized for signs of guilt or innocence. The human element was lost in a sea of speculation and judgment. We must remember that behind the flashbulbs and the headlines were parents who had lost a child in the most violent way possible, and a brother, Burke, who was only 9 years old and suddenly thrust into a world of suspicion. The weight of this loss is unimaginable. The tragedy was not just the death of a little girl, but the slow, painful erosion of a family's reputation and the peace of an entire city. As the snow continued to fall on the mountains of Colorado, the investigation began to stall, caught between conflicting theories and a lack of clear evidence. The ransom note, the basement, the pageant videos, all of it swirled into a vortex of mystery that seemed to defy logic. The complexity of the case lies in these contradictions. Why write such a long note if the child was already dead? Why leave her body in the basement? These questions are the thorns that have pricked the conscience of investigators for nearly 3 decades. As we move forward, we must look at the psychological toll this took on everyone involved. The detectives who couldn't sleep, the neighbors who locked their doors for the first time, and the millions of people who felt a personal connection to a girl they never met. Jean Benet became a symbol of a lost era of safety, a reminder that evil can exist in the most beautiful places. The pain of the Ramsey family was amplified by a legal system that seemed to be at war with itself as the local police in the district attorney's office clashed over the direction of the case. This friction only served to further obscure the path to justice, leaving a wound that refused to heal. As we conclude this first chapter of the story, we are left standing in that cold basement, looking at the place where a life was extinguished. The echoes of Patsy's 911 call and the sight of John's grief are the foundations of this narrative. It is a story of a beautiful life cut short in a search for answers that has spanned generations. The tragedy of Jean Benet Ramsey is not just a cold case. It is a human story of love, loss, and the enduring quest for truth in a world that often feels dark and indifferent. We are reminded that every piece of evidence, every DNA sample, and every witness statement represents a step toward understanding what happened on that quiet Christmas night. The journey is long, and the shadows are deep, but the memory of the little girl with the golden hair continues to drive us forward, seeking the light of justice in a case that has come to define the very essence of American mystery. The silence of the snow in Boulder remains, but the voice of the victim still whispers, demanding to be heard through the decades of uncertainty and pain. As the afternoon shadows of December 26th lengthened across the snow-draped peaks of Boulder, the atmosphere inside the Ramsey mansion shifted from the frantic chaos of the morning to a heavy, deathly stillness. It was a kind of silence that only those who have touched the void of absolute tragedy can truly understand. A silence that hung in the air like a suspended blade, where every breath felt labored and every tick of the grandfather clock sounded like a passing sentence. John Ramsey, a man who had built a life on control and corporate precision, now looked like a ghost haunting his own halls. The police and detective Linda Arndt remained in a state of agonizing limbo, waiting for a sign, a ransom call, or a miracle that felt increasingly out of reach. But in cases of missing children, time is a cruel and relentless predator, and as the clock approached 1 p.m., the human capacity for endurance finally reached its breaking point. Detective Arndt, perhaps sensing the unbearable tension or hoping to channel the family's desperation into action, suggested that John and his close friend Fleet White search the house one more time. There was something in the father's intuition, a subconscious pull from the shadows, that led John down the narrow, dimly lit stairs into the basement. The Ramsey basement was not a simple open space. It was a labyrinth of small rooms, storage nooks, and the forgotten remnants of family life. As they approached the wine cellar, a small windowless room tucked deep within the foundation, John opened a door that should have remained closed forever. In the faint, flickering light, a small shape lay on the cold floor, covered by a white blanket that stood in mocking contrast to the darkness surrounding it. The moment John Ramsey looked upon JonBenet was not just the moment of discovery, it was the total collapse of a universe. A primal, soul-shattering cry erupted from the basement, traveling through the floorboards and piercing the ears of everyone above, signaling that all hope had officially turned to ash. He gathered his daughter's tiny, lifeless body into his arms, rushing up the stairs in a blur of grief and placing her on the living room floor before the horrified eyes of those gathered. The sight of a father kneeling over his broken child, a girl who only hours ago was the light of his life, is a portrait of agony that transcends language. JonBenet lay there, her hands bound above her head, black duct tape sealing her lips, and a garrote cinched tightly around her neck. She looked as if she were merely sleeping, but the unnatural chill of her skin spoke of a finality that no prayer could undo. John's instinctive act of carrying his daughter, a father's desperate reflex to protect and hold his child one last time, unintentionally created a forensic nightmare. In that singular moment of love and despair, the last pristine traces of the killer were blurred. Fibers were shifted, DNA was cross-contaminated, and the physical truth of the crime was smudged by the very hands that wanted to save her. The investigators watched with a heavy sense of helplessness. They weren't just looking at a murder, they were looking at a scene that had been compromised by the rawest form of human emotion. The initial sympathy for the family began to be shadowed by a cold, clinical suspicion from the authorities. Why was the body here? Why would a kidnapper kill a child and leave her in the very home they had supposedly invaded? As the autopsy began to strip away the mystery, it revealed a level of savagery that was impossible to reconcile with the image of a 6-year-old girl. JonBenet had not only been strangled, she had suffered a massive, blunt force blow to the head, powerful enough to fracture her skull before her final breath was taken. The garrote itself, fashioned from a nylon cord and a broken paintbrush, handle from Patsy's own art supplies, suggested a chilling level of premeditation and a deeply disturbed psyche. This brutality stood in stark opposition to the glittering image of JonBenet on the pageant stage. The American culture of the time, already obsessed with the safety of children, was suddenly forced to confront a terrifying possibility: that sometimes the monster doesn't climb through the window from the outside, but instead hides within the most intimate corners of the home. The Ramsey family's grief was quickly transformed into a commodity for the 24-hour news cycle. Images of JonBenet in heavy makeup, her hair coiffed into adult styles, were broadcast into every living room in America, fueling a fire of public judgment. Instead of mourning a murdered child, the public began to dissect the lifestyle and parenting of Patsy and John. There was a disturbing coldness in how society viewed the tragedy, as if the family's perceived perfection was a mask that deserved to be torn away. We see here a profound cultural fracture. The belief in the sanctity of the upper-class family was being violently shaken. Patsy Ramsey, with her polished exterior and shattering heart, became the target of cruel whispers. People looked at the strange, overly long ransom note and began to wonder, could a mother have written those words to hide a truth even more horrific? The initial empathy felt for the family was gradually replaced by a thick atmosphere of suspicion that settled over the city of Boulder. The police began to focus almost exclusively on an inner circle theory, citing the anomalies at the scene: no footprints in the fresh snow outside, no clear signs of forced entry, and the existence of a ransom note written on a pad found inside the house. Every move John and Patsy made was tracked by dozens of camera lenses. Their life had transitioned from a beautiful dream into a grim reality television show, where every tear was analyzed for its authenticity. Their isolation and their grief was something few could understand, as the world seemed to turn its back, waiting for a confession or a total breakdown. In JonBenét's room, the Christmas presents remained untouched, their bright wrapping paper now a somber testament to a stolen childhood. The dolls and the sparkly dresses were no longer toys. They were silent witnesses to a life cut short. We feel the slow, rhythmic pulse of despair as the first days of the investigation passed without an arrest. Each night, as the cold Colorado darkness descended, parents in the area hugged their children a little tighter and locked their doors a little earlier. But the fear had already seeped through the cracks. The truth of what happened in that wine cellar remained a secret held only by the cold stone walls. The logic of the investigation began to spiral into internal relationships. Detectives questioned 9-year-old Burke, who had been in the house that night. They looked into John's past, the family's employees, and anyone who might have known about the specific bonus amount mentioned in the note. But amidst the maze of theories, one undeniable truth remained. A small soul had been taken in the most cruel manner. Tension between the Boulder Police Department and the district attorney's office began to fester, creating a deep divide in the pursuit of justice. One side was eager to indict the family at any cost, while the other remained cautious in the face of a lack of direct physical evidence. As we conclude this chapter, we are left with the image of the Ramseys standing amidst the ruins of their lives. The major questions remain unanswered, and suspicion, like a slow-acting poison, has begun to dissolve the very fabric of their world. JonBené was gone, but her ghost would haunt not only this house, but the conscience of a nation for decades to come. This was no longer just a murder case. It was the start of a long war between the truth and the narrative, between private agony and public judgment. And in the hushed winter air of Colorado, justice remained a distant, flickering light, obscured by the fog of doubt and the secrets that still lay buried in the basement. As we move into the third chapter of this harrowing saga, the initial shock that paralyzed the city of Boulder began to crystallize into something much more complex and divisive. The silence of the basement had been replaced by the loud, discordant voices of a nation demanding answers. In the days following the discovery of JonBenét's body, the investigation entered a phase of intense, almost clinical scrutiny, where every piece of paper and every drop of biological matter was treated as a potential key to a locked door. The focus shifted from the tragedy of a lost child to a high-stakes psychological puzzle, centered primarily on a document that remains one of the most debated pieces of evidence in criminal history: the ransom note. To understand the weight of this document, one must look at it not just as a piece of evidence, but as a window into a mind. Stretching across 2.5 pages of a notepad found inside the Ramsey kitchen, the note was an anomaly. Most ransom notes are brief, blunt, and designed to minimize the risk of detection. This one was different. It was theatrical, filled with pop culture references in a strange, pseudo-intellectual tone. It spoke of a foreign faction and used phrases like, "Use that good Southern common sense of yours." For the investigators, this raised a haunting question. Why would a killer, standing in a house with a dead child in the basement, take the time to compose such a lengthy, dramatic narrative? The logic felt skewed, as if the note were not a demand for money, but a script written to direct the eyes of the police away from a much closer, much darker reality. The cultural impact of this scrutiny was profound. In the mid-1990s, the American public was deeply invested in the idea of the perfect family, and the Ramseys were the ultimate protagonists of that story. But as the details of the note and the anomalies of the crime scene leaked to the press, the narrative began to flip. The human element was slowly replaced by a culture of suspicion. People looked at Patsy Ramsey's handwriting and compared it to the looping letters of the ransom note. They looked at John Ramsey's business success and wondered if the $118,000 demand was a deliberate clue, left by someone who knew the intimate details of their finances. The suspicion didn't just stay in the interrogation rooms. It bled into the grocery stores, the local churches, and the dinner tables across America. The very people who had once admired the Ramseys were now the ones dissecting their every word for a hint of deception. Amidst this growing storm, the forensic evidence provided its own set of contradictions. On one hand, the intruder theory gained ground through the discovery of an unidentified male DNA profile found on JonBenét's underwear. This was a physical fact, a microscopic footprint of someone who did not belong in that house. It spoke of a predator who had moved through the shadows, a monster who had bypassed the security of a wealthy home to commit an unthinkable act. This theory offered a terrifying but clear explanation. Evil had come from the outside. Yet on the other hand, the inner circle theory was bolstered by the lack of physical evidence of a break-in. There were no footprints in the fresh snow, no forced entry that made sense, and a broken basement window that seemed too small and covered in undisturbed cobwebs to be a viable path for an intruder. The psychological toll on those involved was immense. We must remember that in the center of this legal and forensic tug-of-war was a 9-year-old boy named Burke. While the world focused on his parents, Burke was a child who had lost his sister and was suddenly living in a home that felt like a prison. The investigators, caught between these two powerful and conflicting theories, began to fracture. The Boulder Police Department, led by men like Steve Thomas, became convinced of the family's involvement, seeing the ransom note as a desperate attempt at a cover-up. Meanwhile, seasoned investigators like Lou Smith, who had seen more than his share of darkness, looked at the DNA and the brutality of the garrote and saw the work of a seasoned predator. This was not just a disagreement over facts. It was a battle for the soul of the investigation. The tension between these perspectives created a slow, rhythmic pulse of frustration that defined the case for years. Every time a new piece of evidence surfaced, it was filtered through the lens of whichever theory an investigator subscribed to. If you believe the parents were involved, the pineapple found in JonBenét's stomach, a snack she had apparently eaten shortly before her death, despite her parents saying she had been asleep, was a smoking gun of a domestic dispute gone wrong. If you believed in an intruder, that same pineapple was simply a detail that highlighted the gaps in the timeline. This polarization meant that the truth was no longer the primary goal. Winning the argument was, and in that environment, the memory of JonBené herself began to fade, replaced by a caricature of a victim in a beauty pageant dress. We feel the empathy for the victims of this process, not just the deceased, but the living who were being devoured by the machinery of public opinion. The American legal system is designed to be impartial, but in the Ramsey case, it was anything but. The media circus had turned the case into a spectator sport. There was a sense of cultural betrayal. If a family like the Ramseys couldn't be trusted, who could? This fear drove the hunger for a culprit, and when the police couldn't provide one, the public created their own. The human tragedy was that the search for justice had become so toxic that it was impossible for any conclusion to be accepted by everyone. As the years began to crawl forward, the investigation seemed to settle into a permanent state of stalemate. The grand jury proceedings in 1999, which were kept secret for over a decade, reflected this internal struggle. They had seen enough evidence to vote for an indictment of the parents on charges of child abuse resulting in death. Yet the district attorney, Alex Hunter, refused to sign the indictment, citing a lack of evidence to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. This decision was a gut punch to those who wanted immediate accountability, but it was also a reflection of the terrifying uncertainty that sat at the heart of the case. It was a moment where the law admitted it was lost in the woods. The logic of the investigation had reached its limit. We are left with a landscape of shattered trust and unfinished business. The human experience of the Ramsey case in this period was one of profound isolation. John and Patsy were no longer citizens. They were suspects in the eyes of the world, living behind closed curtains in a house that was no longer a home. The vibrant, joyful child who had once run through those halls was gone, and in her place was a mountain of legal briefs, forensic reports, and unanswered questions. The rhythm of the story had slowed to a mournful crawl, a reminder that some wounds don't heal. They only become part of the history of a place. Closing this section, we see the case poised on the edge of a new era, one where the old arguments would meet the new realities of science. But for now, the ghost of JonBenet remained in that house. Her voice silenced, but her presence felt in every debate and every headline. The struggle between the intruder and the family, between the DNA and the ransom note, had created a knot that no one seemed able to untie. As the 1990s drew to a close, the mystery of Boulder, Colorado, had become a permanent part of the American psyche, a somber lesson in the limits of human understanding and the enduring power of a secret kept in the dark. The questions remained, the pain deepened, and the world waited for a sign that justice was still possible in a world that had forgotten how to believe in it. As the investigation stalled in the late 1990s, the Ramsey case transitioned from a local tragedy into a national obsession, fueled by a media landscape that was beginning to hunger for a new kind of visceral entertainment. The quiet, tree-lined streets of Boulder were no longer just a backdrop for a murder. They became the stage for a cultural war. We must look at the human cost of this transition, where the grief of a family was repurposed as a script for tabloid television and 24-hour news cycles. The images of JonBenet, often shown in slow motion with a haunting musical score, became a fixture in American living rooms. Yet behind those images were people whose lives were being systematically dismantled by the weight of public perception. Patsy and John Ramsey were no longer viewed as grieving parents, but as characters in a dark mystery, their every facial expression analyzed by body language experts, and their every word dissected for hidden meanings. This was a period of profound cultural judgment. In the United States, the concept of the innocent victim is often tied to an idealized vision of childhood. When that vision was complicated by the reality of the child beauty pageant world, the public's sympathy began to curdle into something colder. There was a sense that the Ramseys were other, that their lifestyle was too polished, too artificial, and therefore suspicious. This cultural disconnect created a fertile ground for rumors to thrive. The media didn't just report the facts. They created a narrative where the family was guilty until proven innocent. We feel the suffocating pressure this must have placed on the family, particularly on young Burke. who was growing up in a house where the windows were constantly flashes of paparazzi bulbs and the air was thick with the scent of scandal. It was a secondary trauma, a slow-motion car crash that the entire world was watching with a mixture of horror and fascination. The psychological toll on Patsy Ramsey, in particular, was visible to anyone who cared to look beneath the surface of her composed exterior. She was a woman who had fought stage 4 ovarian cancer just years before the murder, a survivor who was now being accused of the unthinkable. The physical decline of the family members during this period was a testament to the corrosive nature of unproven suspicion. They were living in a state of permanent defense, forced to hire public relations, teams, and high-priced lawyers just to navigate the basic functions of their lives. This isolation was absolute. Friends drifted away, unable to handle the heat of the spotlight, and the community of Boulder, once their sanctuary, became a place of whispered accusations. The human heart can only bear so much before it begins to fracture, and for the Ramseys, those fractures were becoming deep, permanent canyons. The legal machinery continued to grind, but it was a machine without a driver. The 1999 grand jury decision, which remained a secret for years, was a pivotal moment of systemic failure. When the jurors voted to indict the parents, they weren't necessarily saying they were sure of their guilt, but that there was enough probable cause to move forward. However, District Attorney Alex Hunter's refusal to sign those indictments created a legal limbo that was perhaps more cruel than a trial would have been. It meant there would be no day in court, no opportunity for the family to clear their names, and no finality for the public. The case became a ghost that haunted the halls of the justice system, a reminder of what happens when the burden of proof is outweighed by the burden of public opinion. As we moved into the early 2000s, the case took on a more mournful rhythm. The initial fire of the investigation had burned down to embers, leaving behind a landscape of scorched reputations and unanswered questions. The death of Patsy Ramsey in 2006 at the age of 49 marked the end of an era. She died without ever seeing the killer of her daughter brought to justice, and without ever being fully exonerated in the eyes of the public. Her passing was a somber reminder that time waits for no one, not even for the truth. For John Ramsey, the loss of his wife and the continued cloud over his family became a cross he had to carry alone. We are forced to confront the reality that for some families, justice is not a destination they ever reach. It is a horizon that keeps receding the further they walk toward it. The impact on the Boulder community was equally lasting. The city had lost more than just a child. It had lost its sense of invulnerability. The case had exposed the flaws in their police department and the deep divisions within their legal system. It changed the way parents looked at their neighbors and the way they watched their children at play. The before and after of the Ramsey case is a permanent line in the history of the town. Cultural historians often point to this case as the moment when the American public became truly cynical about the ability of the law to protect the wealthy and the prominent, while simultaneously being obsessed with their downfall. It was a paradox of the human spirit, a desire for justice mixed with a hunger for spectacle. Amidst the silence of those middle years, there were occasional flashes of hope, but they often turned out to be cruel mirages. The most famous was the 2006 arrest of John Mark Carr in Thailand. For a few days, it seemed the mystery was finally over. Carr claimed he loved Jean Benet and was present at her death. The world held its breath. But as the DNA results came back and the logistics of his story fell apart, the realization set in that this was just another false lead, another person drawn to the dark gravity of the case. The disappointment was visceral. It showed how much the public wanted a villain, someone they could point to and say, "There is the monster." When Carr was released, the case felt even more hopeless than before, as if the truth were actively hiding from those trying to find it. We must also consider the role of the internet in this period. The Ramsey case was one of the first to be truly crowdsourced by armchair detectives. Message boards and early websites were filled with thousands of pages of analysis, some of it brilliant, much of it toxic. This digital echo chamber amplified the suspicion and kept the case alive long after the traditional news cycle had moved on. It created a world where everyone was an expert and no theory was too wild to be entertained. For the Ramsey family, this meant that the accusations were no longer just in the newspapers. They were everywhere, accessible with the click of a button, permanent and unyielding. The human experience of being a public suspect in the digital age is a form of modern purgatory. The logic of the narrative during these years was one of circularity. The same evidence was looked at 1,000 different ways, but the conclusions never changed. The ransom note was still strange, the basement was still cold, and the DNA was still unidentified. The emotional weight of this stasis was crushing. It was a story with a beginning and a middle, but no end in sight. The empathy we feel for JonBenet in this chapter is for the way her memory was used as a weapon in these arguments. She was no longer a little girl who liked to play and laugh. She was a set of forensic markers, a series of photographs, a pawn in a game of legal chess. The human soul of the victim was being buried under the weight of the investigation itself. Closing this section, we reflect on the resilience of the human spirit in the face of such overwhelming darkness. John Ramsey's continued efforts to keep his daughter's memory alive, despite the personal cost, speak to a father's enduring love. The case had become a somber lesson in the limits of forensics and the power of narrative. As the first decade of the 2000s came to a close, the mystery of JonBenet Ramsey remained as cold as the Colorado winter. The world had changed, technology had advanced, but the secrets of that night in 1996 were still locked away. The quest for justice had become a marathon, one where the finish line was obscured by the fog of history and the ghosts of those who had already passed away. The story was far from over, but the path forward was narrower than it had ever been, leaving us to wonder if the truth would ever find its way into the light. As the case drifted into the second decade of the new millennium, the air around the Ramsey mystery began to change, shifting from the stagnant weight of old suspicions toward the clinical, piercing light of modern science. The narrative of the previous years had been a carousel of the same faces and the same theories, but now the ghosts in the files began to meet the cold reality of a changing world. We must look at the human persistence that defined this era, where the search for justice was no longer just a police matter, but a crusade led by those who refused to let JonBenet's memory be reduced to a tabloid headline. The logic of the investigation was being rewritten by a new generation of technology, one that didn't care about the drama of the ransom note or the perceived oddities of a grieving mother. It cared only for the microscopic truth left behind in the fibers of a 6-year-old girl's clothing. The cultural shift in America was equally palpable. The true crime genre was evolving from sensationalized talk shows into a more sophisticated, analytical pursuit. Audiences were no longer satisfied with simple villains. They wanted to understand the how and the why of forensic failure. This new scrutiny brought the internal conflicts of the Boulder investigation back into the spotlight. We feel the lingering frustration of the investigators who had spent their careers at odds with one another. Steve Thomas, who had resigned in protest years earlier, and Lou Smith, who continued to work the case until his final breath in 2010, represented the two halves of a broken heart. Smith, even as he faced his own mortality, kept a detailed spreadsheet of potential intruders, a list of names that he believed held the key to the basement door. His dedication was a testament to the belief that in every cold case there is a thread that, if pulled hard enough, will eventually unravel the entire mystery. The emotional core of this chapter is the concept of exoneration. In 2008, a landmark moment occurred when Mary Lacey, the district attorney at the time, took the unprecedented step of formally clearing the Ramsey family of any involvement in the murder. This decision was based on touch DNA technology, which found profiles of an unknown male on John Benet's leggings that matched the DNA previously found on her underwear. For the first time in 12 years, the official record stated what the Ramseys had maintained from the beginning. They were victims, not perpetrators. The human impact of this letter was profound. For John Ramsey, it was a bittersweet victory that arrived too late for Patsy. We can only imagine the weight that must have lifted, even as the grief remained, knowing that the state finally acknowledged the intruder who had haunted their lives. However, in the world of true crime, even a breakthrough is rarely the end of the story. The 2008 exoneration was met with immediate pushback from those who had spent years building the case against the family. Critics argued that the DNA was trace and could have been the result of environmental contamination at a manufacturing plant. This back and forth created a new kind of psychological torment for the survivors. It showed that even science could be weaponized in the court of public opinion. The culture of doubt had become so deeply ingrained in the American psyche regarding this case that not even a DNA match was enough to satisfy everyone. The tragedy was no longer just the murder, but the fact that the truth had become a matter of belief rather than a matter of fact. As we look at the suspects who lingered in the shadows during this time, we see a gallery of broken lives and missed opportunities. Names like Linda Hoffman Pugh, the housekeeper who had been under intense pressure, or Bill McReynolds, the man who played Santa Claus and was a favorite of John Benet's, were reminders of how a single event can cast a shadow over an entire community. These were people whose reputations were collateral damage in a war of theories. The empathy we feel in this chapter must extend to those who were caught in the crossfire of a desperate search for a culprit. It highlights a somber truth about the American justice system. When a crime is this high profile, the need for an answer often outweighs the need for accuracy, leaving a trail of ruined lives in its wake. The logic of the narrative now began to focus on the unknown male whose DNA had been found. Who was he? Was he a drifter, a local predator, or someone lurking on the fringes of the pageant circuit? The mystery had moved from the who of the family to the who of the shadows. The rhythm of the investigation became one of waiting. Waiting for a match in a database, waiting for a deathbed confession, waiting for a piece of evidence to finally make sense. The human experience of this waiting is one of quiet, grinding desperation. For John Ramsey, now an older man, the quest became about legacy. He began to speak out more frequently, not just for his daughter, but for the reform of how cold cases are handled in America. His voice, once defensive, was now the voice of an advocate, a father who had been through the fire and was determined to ensure that no other family would have to endure the same trial by media. Cultural reflections on the case during this period also began to reevaluate John Benet herself. Documentary filmmakers and journalists started to look past the makeup and the costumes to find the little girl who loved her brother and her dog. This rehumanization was a necessary correction to the years of tabloid exploitation. It allowed the public to feel a different kind of grief, not for a celebrity victim, but for a child whose life was a series of moments that had been stolen. The pain of her absence was most keenly felt in the family's quiet gatherings, where there was always one empty chair, one voice missing from the holiday carols. The contrast between the public spectacle and the private mourning is the heartbeat of this entire story. By the mid-2010s, the case had reached another plateau. The initial excitement over the DNA had leveled off as no immediate match was found in the CODIS database. This led to a period of deep introspection for the Boulder Police Department. Under new leadership, they began to reconsider the cold case status of the file, realizing that the old ways of investigating were no longer sufficient. The logic of the narrative shifted toward the future of forensics, specifically the emerging field of investigative genetic genealogy. This was the same technology that would eventually solve the Golden State Killer case, and it offered a glimmer of hope for John Benet. The idea was simple but revolutionary. If you can't find the killer in a criminal database, find his relatives in a public one. We conclude this section with the image of a file that is never truly closed. The Ramsey case had become a permanent part of the American landscape, a somber monument to the limits of human certainty. The empathy we feel for the victims is now joined by a respect for the scientists and investigators who refuse to give up. The story had become a test of endurance, a question of who would last longer, the secrets of the past or the technology of the future. As the world moved closer to the 25th anniversary of the crime, the shadows in the Boulder basement seemed a little less impenetrable. The truth was still hidden, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like it was within reach. The quest for justice had moved from the courtroom to the laboratory, and the silence of the winter night was about to be broken by the persistent, unyielding whispers of the code. The human element of this journey is the realization that justice is not just about a verdict, it is about the restoration of truth. For the Ramsey family, for the city of Boulder, and for a nation that had been captivated for decades, the next chapter promised to be the most definitive yet. The ghosts of the past were being met by the pioneers of the future, and the memory of the little girl with the golden hair remained the guiding light through the darkness. The path was long, the cost was high, but the commitment to finding the answer remained as strong as it was on that first cold morning in December. The world waited, with a collective breath held tight, for the moment when the final piece of the puzzle would click into place and the long, painful silence would finally come to an end. As we enter this final chapter, we find ourselves standing at the precipice of a new dawn, where the cold, unyielding shadows of a 30-year mystery are finally meeting the relentless fire of modern innovation. The journey from that frost-bitten morning in 1996 to the present day has been a long, agonizing walk through a desert of unanswered questions, but the rhythm of the story is now quickening. We must look at the human spirit of John Ramsey, now an elder statesman of grief, whose voice has grown steady and firm with the passing of time. He is no longer the man hiding behind closed curtains, but a father demanding that the world use every tool at its disposal to find the truth for his daughter. His plea is not just for his family, but for the very soul of justice in a country that has been haunted by the image of a little girl in a velvet dress for far too long. The logic of this final stage is centered on a singular, powerful concept: investigative genetic genealogy. This is the technology that has turned the tide in dozens of cold cases across America, transforming a microscopic drop of DNA into a roadmap that leads directly to a killer's doorstep. For years, the unidentified male DNA found on John Benet's clothing was a dead end, a whisper in a room full of noise. But now it is a beacon. The cultural shift toward forensic transparency has forced a new level of cooperation between the Boulder Police Department and private laboratories that specialize in this gold standard of testing. We feel the mounting tension, the collective intake of breath as the world waits for the moment the code is finally cracked. This is no longer a game of psychological theories or ransom note analysis. It is a search for a name, a face, and a legacy of accountability. The empathy in this concluding chapter must be reserved for the quiet, enduring pain of a loss that never heals. We think of John Benet, who would now be a woman in her 30s, perhaps with a family and a career of her own. The tragedy is not just in how she died, but in the decades of life that were stolen from her. The American culture that once fetishized her image has begun to reflect on its own role in the spectacle, moving toward a more compassionate understanding of the child behind the crown. There is a sense of collective responsibility to see this through to the end. The community of Boulder, once divided by suspicion, is now united by a quiet, persistent hope that the dark cloud over their city will finally lift. The silence of the basement is being answered by the loud, clear voice of science, and the weight of history is beginning to shift. As the investigation enters its most definitive phase, we are reminded of the words of those who have spent their lives on the case. The logic of the narrative suggests that the killer was not a ghost or a figment of a foreign faction, but a person of flesh and bone who has walked among us, carrying a secret that has defined a generation. The focus on the garrote, that intricate, brutal knot, remains a haunting detail. Investigators believe that the complexity of that knot is a signature, a piece of evidence that technology will eventually link to a specific hand. The human experience of this case is now a race against time. As witnesses age and memories fade, every new update from the Boulder police, every mention of new leads and retesting, is a reminder that the file is never truly closed until the truth is told. The emotional climax of this story is the realization that justice, however delayed, is a fundamental human right. For John Ramsey, the hope is that he will live to see the day when the handcuffs click shut. For the rest of us, it is the hope that the American legal system can find its way back to a place of certainty. We are left with the image of the snowy peaks of Colorado, standing silent and eternal, witnesses to a crime that they will never forget. The story of JonBenet Ramsey is a testament to the fact that even in the deepest darkness, there are those who will continue to carry the light. It is a story of a beautiful life, a tragic end, and a search for truth that has become a part of our national identity. We conclude this long, winding narrative not with a period, but with an ellipsis. The answers are closer than they have ever been, and the whispers of the DNA are growing louder with every passing day. The little girl with the golden hair and the radiant smile is no longer a mystery to be debated, but a child to be remembered and a victim to be avenged. The quest for justice is a marathon, not a sprint, and as we look toward the horizon, we can see the first glimmers of a resolution. The long, painful night that began on Christmas in 1996 is finally moving toward the morning. The truth is coming, and when it arrives, it will not just be a headline. It will be a homecoming for a soul that has been lost in the shadows for far too long. In the final analysis, the case of JonBenet Ramsey teaches us about the fragility of peace and the enduring power of love. It reminds us that every child deserves to be safe in their home, and that no secret is dark enough to stay hidden forever. The legacy of this case will be the lives it changed, the laws it inspired, and the unwavering commitment of those who refuse to let it go. As the snow continues to fall on the quiet streets of Boulder, we hold on to the belief that the light will eventually find its way into every corner of the basement, and that the long-awaited answer is finally within our reach. The silence is broken, the code is speaking, and the memory of JonBenet Ramsey remains a guiding light for us all. The long journey is almost over, and the truth at last is coming home. The story of JonBenet Ramsey is a haunting reminder that even the coldest cases still hold a flicker of hope as long as the world refuses to forget. For nearly 30 years, her name has been a whisper in the dark, but with every new breakthrough in science and every voice that demands the truth, we move one step closer to the light. If you felt the weight of this journey, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. Your support helps us keep these stories alive, ensuring that victims are never reduced to forgotten files. Together, we can make sure the search for justice never falls silent. Like this video to honor JonBenet's memory, and tell us in the comments, do you believe the truth will finally surface in our lifetime? Stay vigilant, stay compassionate, and take care of your loved ones.